Hello everyone. Today I'll be covering Chapter 2 in the AMSCO United States Government and Politics AP Edition book. This chapter is about federalism, and we will look into what that means. First, to understand federalism, we must look for the definition. Federalism is defined as a sharing of power between the central government and the equal sovereign regional governments. You may be asking yourself, what does this mean? In simpler terms, the central government of a nation, such as in Washington, D.C., cannot manage small local problems while also tackling the national issues America faces. So sovereign regional governments and local governments exist to deal with the problems inside the states or towns, while the national government deals with national issues. To further understand federalism, we must look to how it is defined by our founding fathers in the Constitution and Bill of Rights. This is a table that describes every section of the Constitution or amendment in the Bill of Rights that relates to federalism. In Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it states that Congress has enumerated powers which are also clearly expressed in the Constitution of what powers are given to each branch of government. This article also states, through the necessary and proper clause, or elastic clause, that the federal government has the ability to make laws that will be beneficial to the nation and public. In Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, it states the powers that are denied to Congress, as there was no regulating the slave trade until 1808, and that states are to be treated equally by the federal government. In Article 1, Section 10, it specifically states that what powers the states cannot have, which include making treaties and repairing contracts. In Article 4, it states the full faith and credit, privileges and immunities, and extradition clauses that we'll define on the next slide. Article 6 of the Constitution, it states the supremacy of the national government, which is a supremacy clause. Now in the Bill of Rights, the 9th Amendment states that rights not listed are reserved by the people. The 10th Amendment states that powers that are not given to the federal government are reserved for the states. Here are 4 clauses from this chapter that must be remembered. First, the full faith and credit clauses states that each state must respect each other's public acts, records, and judicial proceedings. This was on the last quiz, and the problem given was a business contract. And the business contract is under the public records that other states must respect. Next, the privileges and immunities clause defines that each citizens of other states should be treated fairly by other states. This does not apply to public college tuition, though, as in-state residents pay their state taxes, and out-of-state residents do not. The extradition clause requires states to deliver captured fugitive criminals back to the state where they committed the original crime. Unfortunately, this clause has been historically used to capture runaway slaves. One example of the extradition clause would be if I stole my friend's car in New York and drove to Florida. Florida is now obligated to capture me and return me to the authority of New York State. Finally, we have the supremacy clause. This clause puts national law above state authority. This does not mean that the federal government has total power over state laws and public life, as national law is limited by the enumerated list of Congress's powers in the Constitution. If an act by Congress is put in the power, but the Supreme Court did not determine if it is constitutional, the states still must adhere to it. An important thing to understand is what type of government our nation has. The United States has a federal government system, while some other countries, such as in the United Kingdom, have a unitary system of government. What are the differences between these systems of government? In a unitary government, there is one central government, and throughout the land, the laws created by that unitary government are all the same and apply on a local level as well. In a federal government system, there's a central government, then there's a smaller sovereign regional governments that have their own power too, such as state governments. In this federal government system, the power is shared between the sovereign regional governments and the central government. As we discussed earlier, this is federalism. Here is the United Kingdom, which is a small nation which makes it easier to govern with a unitary government system. Next is the United States, which has a federal government system, which for a large nation is beneficial, as there needs to be a government to deal with the local and state issues, while a central government can deal with most of the national problems, making it easier given the size. Next, we must know the types of powers our government has. First, we have the expressed or delegated powers. This also can be seen as enumerated. These powers are given to the federal government that are specifically written in the Constitution. Next, we have reserved powers, which are powers not specifically found in the Constitution, and so these powers go to the states. Finally, concurrent powers are the powers of government that the states and federal government share. Here is a Venn diagram of the power shared and held by the federal and state government. I will summarize it very quickly. The federal government's enumerated powers include the ability to make a military, coin money, regulate trade, and declare war. The state government has reserved powers over schools, marriage, safety, and health. While concurrent powers both governments have are over law enforcement, the courts, and taxing. The next part of this chapter is understanding federalism throughout history. In colonial America, there were two types of people: the people who thought the Constitution should be interpreted strictly, and the ones who thought the Constitution should be interpreted loosely. The people who believed in loose interpretation were called loose constructionists. Those who believed in strict interpretation were called strict constructionists. Now there's some political groups involved. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, believed in a strict construction of the Constitution, while the Federalists, such as Alexander Hamilton, believed in a loose construction of the Constitution. Now this becomes a problem, as both of them debate if the government can make a national bank. Hamilton says yes, but Jefferson says no, because the Constitution doesn't say so. We will get to this debate later when we cover court cases at the end. Then there's compact theory and nullification. This was seen with Thomas Jefferson. Compact theory is that all states agree to become a federal government so they can judge when federal authorities cross the line of their limited authority. Then Jefferson wrote about the idea of nullification, which is that if a state thought that the law violated the Constitution, they can declare it null and void. Nullification, however, conflicts with the supremacy clause in the Constitution. Next, in the 19th century, we begin to see two important concepts: dual federalism and selective exclusiveness. Dual federalism is an idea where the federal and state governments are supreme in their own sphere. This means that the federal government cannot interfere with state powers, and the state governments cannot interfere with federal powers. This idea is once again seen with this Venn diagram demonstrating the powers in their spheres. Next is selective exclusiveness, which states that only Congress may regulate trade and commerce when the commodity or good requires a national uniform rule. Now we're moving forward with the Progressive Era and the New Deal. During this time period, we see the size of the federal government expand with the creation of the federal income tax, with the 16th Amendment, and the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This rose because of the nation's problems, such as commerce went from a local to a larger state level as cars and trucks became important in transporting goods across the nation. One court case that is good to know is Hammer versus Dagenhart, where the Supreme Court ruled that child labor was evil only in the sphere of manufacturing, not commerce, so Congress could not do anything about child labor. Later, the decision was overturned in the New Deal, as the government had broader powers, so then the Supreme Court overturned their past court ruling. This is a very important topic for the test to understand, which is grants and how they work. The federal grants program works like this. Congress collects federal tax dollars and distributes these funds to the states to tackle national issues. This is called revenue sharing, cooperative federalism, or fiscal federalism. Grants and aids programs help states take care of basic state needs. Categorical grants are grants that have particular congressional guidelines or requirements to be given to states. Strings are known as the specific requirement for grants. Some states felt they had too many strings attached for grants, so in response, Congress introduced the block grant. Block grants offer large sums of money to states for an overarching purpose and have less harsh requirements to be given to states. Finally, there are conditions of aid, which become popular in the mid to late 1900s, which are pretty much categorical grants with strings. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan pushed for a smaller federal government with this idea of new federalism after a long period of expansion of federal government in the 1900s. Mandates are another important aspect of government to remember. These are demands for the states, set by the federal government to comply with a federal objective, and sometimes if they comply, they get rewarded with grants. Two examples of mandates would be with the federal government issuing a mandate for state governments to meet the standards of the Clean Air Act and the American with Disabilities Act. In this era, the idea of de-evolution was introduced in the 1990s, which is the belief that some of the powers assumed by the federal government should go back to the states. Now we are talking about education in relation to government. Initially, education is an issue in society left up to the states, but this was true until the 1960s. In the 1960s, the federal government had to desegregate schools in some areas of the country, and as the Cold War was going on, the federal government wanted to put propaganda in schools against communism. During the Civil Rights Movement, the government expanded and got more involved in state affairs. In 2002, we see George W. Bush's policy on education expand, where he stated every child can learn, and the states and schools are accountable for student learning. But this had heavily idealistic goals and expanded the Department of Education's power over the sphere of education. This was heavily unpopular and criticized as well, and it was seen as a federal policy flop. This could be seen with the political cartoon on the bottom right corner scrutinizing George W. Bush's policy. Here are some more definitions to know in this chapter. Dual federalism is the supremacy of the national and state governments in their own spheres, a Supreme Court doctrine common from the Civil War until the New Deal. Cooperative federalism is defined as the intermingled relationships among the national, state, and local governments to deliver services to citizens. Fiscal federalism is the pattern of taxing, spending, and providing federal grants to state and local governments. New federalism was to return to more distinct lines of responsibility for federal and state governments, which was began by President Ronald Reagan. Revenue sharing is a policy under fiscal federalism that requires both national and local funds for programs. Once again, the evolution is defined as a continued effort to return original reserve powers to the states. Finally, this is the last part of the unit to cover, which are the two most important court cases to remember in this chapter. First, we have McCulloch versus Maryland, and the question in this case was, does the federal government have implied powers under the Elastic and Supremacy Clause? The case was about McCulloch being the chief cashier of a congressional created bank in Baltimore, which was shut down by the Maryland state government, as Maryland stated that it's nowhere in the Constitution that Congress can make a bank. Later in the court, they decided that under the Supremacy and Elastic clauses, that the Congress could make a bank, as this is a ruling for yes that to the question, and all court members agreed unanimously with a vote to 6-0. The next case is United States versus Lopez. The important question being challenged was, does Congress have the authority under the Commerce Clause to outlaw guns near schools? In 1992, Alfonso Lopez carried a handgun with bullets into San Antonio High School. Luckily nothing happened though, and the school confronted him and caught him, then reported him to the federal police. Lopez was sentenced in federal court for a violation, while he challenged the ruling in the Supreme Court as he argued that the federal government had no right to regulate specific behavior at a state-run school. While the United States argued that the connections of guns and drug dealing put this area under federal control due to Congress's Commerce Clause. The court finally answered the question. No, Congress does not have the authority to outlaw guns near schools in a 5-4 ruling, as a gun near school property does not impact interstate commerce and is not covered by Congress's Commerce Clause. Thank you for watching and good luck on the test tomorrow.